Howdy y'all, welcome back to the channel. This is going to be a video for my most diligent viewers who like to hear the more out there theories that have been proposed. Now, this is just going to be a video of what I call coincidences, and you can make of it what you will, but we're going to be talking about the flag of the United States of America, and we're going to dive into a little bit about the stars and the stripes. Now, what we're told is this flag was basically created and inherited or used by our country beginning in 1777. And I'm just going to break down a little bit about what I think or what I noticed and found interesting. Now, one thing that we always seem to find in the 1800s and even well before that, 1700s, 1600s, even in the 1500s, we find forts all around America, or the land that would become America. And these forts, many of them are intricately designed, much like the castles that we hear about in medieval times, Renaissance times, things that we think about in fantasy and lore. Those are the type of castles and forts that were being built around the United States. Now, what we're told is that these forts always have different countries that were here that were building them. So many will lay claim to these forts, and we have different histories from these countries that were given. But let's take those histories out of context, or let's not look at those histories, and let's just focus on the idea of America. We're supposed to be this melting pot of a country, and we come to this new land and basically manifest destiny, and what is here is ours for the taking. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but that seems to be the idea that was in place at the time. So, let's say these people are original ancestors of America, or the original inhabitants who came here from Europe, and the ones that are remaining in power today, the ones that sort of have the line of control that leads to them. If you follow their ancestors back and you look at when they came to the country, we can probably see that they found all of these forts. So what would be a good thing to hide in plain sight if you wanted to make a sort of representation of these star forts and how you came upon these forts, and once you inherited these forts, you were able to gain military power of this entire country. So these forts that were shaped like stars played a very impactful role in the history of America. And where are many of these forts found? Well, nearly all of these forts are found on the coastline. They're found right next to the blue ocean. And I just found that to be really interesting. We're looking at star forts on a blue ocean. And then when we look at the American flag, we're looking at stars and basically represent the concrete or the stone, the brickwork, which many of the star forts, whether it's the weathering from the ocean or not, they seem to appear in a light brick sort of limestone color. We see these white stars on the blue background of the stars and stripes of the American flag. So I just found that to be an interesting sort of coincidence to mention, that we have all these amazing star forts that were founded in America and became part of the American military complex, and we used these forts to basically defend this land, supposedly, and to make it our own, to defend it from these other countries that apparently, at least in the current narrative, built these forts. So essentially we took these forts and then used them to make America what it is today. Now, that's what we're told. So if the stars on the flag actually did represent these forts, it would be very meaningful, and it would at the same time make sense with what the current narrative has to say. But alas, this is just a theory for entertainment that I'm proposing. Now, at the same time, I've been doing a lot of research about the oldest maps of America, and I made a video recently on Norumbega, or Norumbega, which was one of the original large land masses said to be a kingdom that was originally in America. Now, current modern history will tell you this is more of an illusion or a myth, and there was no substantial kingdom that was here. But if you look into the Norwegian narrative, or the history of Norway, and even some of the older books written in English in the 1700s, and I provide links for them in the old video, you can find evidence that there really was a large Norwegian settlement that was in America from the 1100s onward. And what's interesting about that is they are said to have been building large kingdoms and large castles, and they even appear on the oldest maps as these large castles or star forts. So I'm just trying to tie these things together. Now, when we talk about that, and we talk about inheriting the land of America, or the people who own or basically rule America today, what we come to find is they always like to represent the past, and they like to represent history with little nods to that history that not many people would understand. Now, when we look at the stripes of the flag, they are red and they are white. And there is a narrative given about that as well, that the 13 stripes represent the original 13 colonies. But what I want to get into is that the Vikings, or the original Norwegian sailors who came to our land and also went all around the world on their sailing vessels, they are usually depicted all throughout time with a flag that is striped red and white. And that includes Haakon IV and the other Norwegian settlement or settlers that are said to have lived in Norumbega. You can see them depicted in art with this flag that is red and white stripes. So I also want to propose the idea that it's an interesting coincidence, we'll say, that the flag of America also bears these exact same Viking Norwegian colors, or these colors of these so-called original settlers who came to this land but did not document it and did not make maps of it because they lived an entirely different lifestyle. It was more nomadic, and it was more relying on yourself and trusting yourself, and they didn't look for the glory or the promise of what would come by sharing their riches with everyone else. And what the Norwegian narrative about America says is that they resided here for many hundreds of years, basically in solidarity, and they would only really travel outside when they needed different things for their kingdom. So I found that to be really interesting. And if European settlers, other European settlers, were able to come to America at a later time and were able to basically weasel their way into this Norumbega kingdom and take it over, you would expect that they would have found star forts, and you would expect that they would have found massive cities, and you would expect that they would take these cities and turn these cities into their own. So that would also really add itself to the old world narrative that I've talked about in so many videos, how we find these almost pre-existing cities or these large settlements that are said to have popped up in a matter of 10 to 15 years. And we're told basically before Europeans arrived that Native Americans lived here and that these Native Americans had not built anything. But if you look into the history and you look into the actual facts, you'll find that not only did the Native Americans construct massive building projects, including ancient mounds and different earthworks like that, but they were able to use brick and stone and build with that. So we actually have different Native American cultures that are referred to in America as Fort Ancient, and these ancient cultures are said to have built different star forts. Not only do we have original forts that are said to be built by the French, the Swedish, the English, etc., but we also have Native American forts that are said to even predate the European forts, and it seems like they sort of tie together. It's a history that seems to be covered up over time, and it all really stems around the 1100 period when this Norwegian or Viking colony began in America. Now, whether the Vikings worked with the Native Americans or they worked entirely separate, it does appear that many of the oldest cities in America were built out using techniques that were brought here by the Vikings. So that's something lately that I'd never heard before, and I just want to point out the fact that our flag, or at least the striped portion of our flag, is exactly the same as the Vikings that supposedly landed here in about 1100. So if that's not something that's a real interesting coincidence, at least in reference to our flag and the history of America, I don't know what is. So for the rest of this video, I just wanted to take a look at some of these oldest star forts in America and we're going to try and take an aerial view of them. Because the one thing that you'll notice is how perfectly they are constructed, and many of them are said to be built with moats. But besides that, you can see a lot of intricacies on these different forts. You can see that many of them are perfectly symmetrical, and they are over 200, some of them over 300 years old. And that's another part of this narrative, is that many of these predate the American Revolution. They are said to be American forts, but they predate the American Revolution. And I just want to look at a few of them, because you'll notice all of them have entrances where you sort of have to go underground to get into the fort. And it's really interesting to me, just these perfect angles, and you can see evidence of where larger buildings once stood within these forts. You can see sort of the remains of where the brickwork and the groundwork, the lowest level, was of these different buildings that stood here. And on some of these shots, you can definitely get a perspective. Now, it doesn't look all that huge from this angle, but when you zoom in and you realize that we have different homes or different areas of living, different areas for troops and things that were constructed inside this area, and you can see that these homes are dwarfed in size by the remains of the pre-existing structures that are no longer there, or of the infrastructure of these structures that no longer stand. So just imagine how large these were in the 1700s and the 1800s, and then try and put it into a sort of narration that is believable, that will tell us that groups of 300 or 400 soldiers built these massive star fort castles, because at one point they had many more buildings. So we can imagine these looked much like castles when they stood here, and they were built by just 300 or 400 troops. And that's the narrative that we are given. And mind you, at the same time, we're also told that America is mainly undiscovered and undisturbed. So we're told these are built basically in the middle of nowhere. Mind you, they're on the coastline. The coastlines are easy to travel, but to get the parts and the resources and everything there, they would have to sail to these areas, and then they would have to sail the parts in and sail in the brick and the stonework, or find different quarries or areas to quarry nearby to get all of these resources. And we're told that happened while America was basically just forest land and was, you know, the area that the Native Americans were calling home. So they had occupied much of this territory, and basically it was dangerous, is what we're told. We have this whole narrative that we're given that things were much like the Wild West almost, where you couldn't go into the forest, you couldn't get these resources. So the fact that all of these star forts were built all before the American Revolution, and we're told that they were all built by different countries that were just happened to be in the area at the time. It's just so interesting that that's what we're made to believe. So that's what I wanted to get into today. Talk about the stars and the star forts, and talk about the stripes and the Vikings and the Norwegians and that form of Nordic or Norse European that supposedly traveled to and settled this area. And just really interesting, the sort of dichotomy create between that story and the official story that we're told about the stars and stripes. And the last thing I wanted to point out is how, and this is a little bit out there, but if you're familiar with baseball at all, or the American pastime as we call it, you'll come to find that, at least for me, many of the references within baseball seem to point to this old world. And I know that it's a very old sport, it's a very old game, but it's just interesting to me that many of these star forts, and if you look at ones that were torn down or no longer have their walls up, many of these fort areas resemble a baseball diamond or a baseball stadium, even down to the angle that is created. If you look at a baseball diamond, you sort of have this perfect V-shape angle, and then it curves out at the end. And something I noticed, and when I say curves out at the end, that's like the outfield curve, so to speak. That's what they call it. It's a very interesting design. It makes you think, who came up with the game of baseball? Well, what I've been thinking lately is, especially looking at many of these old forts, is the game of baseball seems to have many of its geometrical properties, or the geometry of the game. It seems to be adopted from these ancient mounds. And what I'm saying and what I want to discuss is, what do we talk about you know, when we're looking at baseball, what does the pitcher pitch off of? And what are you looking to hit the ball past or looking to hit the ball over? What are the bases surrounding? You know what I mean? And that is the mound. And I really think that this whole discovery that we see beginning in the 1840s of Native American mounds and Native American sites that are built with geometrical patterns, I believe that that led to the creation of baseball, because you see this whole idea that basically the pitcher is throwing off the mound and the batter needs to hit the ball over or past the mound, and then the bases are around the mound. So once you hit over the mound, then you have to run around the mound basically before the ball gets back to where you hit from. Now, that's a really interesting, if not simple, way to look at baseball. But if you look at all these ancient mounds in the past, it's interesting because even the pitcher is pitching off of the mound. That's what the term is. And looking into baseball further, there's a lot of esoteric properties to it, even down to the amount of strikes and outs and things like that in a game. If you're familiar with the Fibonacci sequence and things like that, there really is a lot of esoteric nature to the game of baseball and America's pastime. And I just see a lot of resemblance between some of the simpler, and I say simple because they're still very intricate, but some of the simpler ancient forts found in America, they really do resemble baseball fields. And I really do think that with the Native American mounds that we find and the Native American quote-unquote star forts that we find, I think there is something there between the game of baseball and the discovery of these mounds that was happening beginning in the 1840s, because right around that time you have the Smithsonian covering up basically these finds and rewriting the history and taking all of these artifacts for themselves. And right around that time, or a little bit after that time, we have the game of baseball that comes to fruition, and we have the idea of pitching and hitting and running around the mound. And I even found a couple photographs that really do indicate that that may be what was going on. I'm not saying that's exactly what was happening, but I found a photograph of what is said to be a game of baseball from the 1860s, and they're literally playing it on the ancient Native American mounds, and the pitcher is pitching off a Native American mound. Now, he's on the lower part of the mound. It's sort of a step mound where the lowest mound is on the bottom and then the mounds get progressively taller. But you can clearly see that this game of baseball, one of the first games of baseball ever played, is being played on ancient Native American mounds. So I just wanted to tie that together with this whole idea of America and the stars and stripes, and we're always forefront with what we're being told, and that's usually not the truth. And when I look at the stars and stripes, at least me personally, I see a lot more there than what we've been told. And I really do think that the stars might represent the concrete or limestone star forts that we see that were built over the blue water. And I do think that the stripes themselves really are exactly like the old Viking flag and the old Norwegian flag and the old Norumbega flag of America. So I really do see an indication there that there may be some influence in our flag from the stars and stripes of our ancient past. So if you enjoyed this video at all, or you disagree or agree, please let me know in the comments down below. I also wanted to point something out just very quickly. If you're going to come to this channel, I want you to share any ideas that you have. I love hearing from absolutely all of you, and I read every comment. Now, that being said, don't think you're gonna sneak any really aggressive or negative comments about me or anybody else on this channel, because I will delete your comment. I'll probably respond to you first, but I will delete your comment. If it has nothing to do with the video, or if you disagree with the video but you are being extremely rude about it or trying to put other people in danger with your words, I am not going to leave that comment on any of my videos. So you can keep wasting your time and leaving those comments all you want, but for us that really want to research this history and help each other out and learn more, it does nothing and it adds nothing to our conversation. So there's no point in it being here. And finally, I also wanted to point out a TV show, which is not something that I usually do, mainly because most of the narratives in TV today are ridiculous and they don't make any sense, and they push different agendas that I have nothing to do with and I want nothing to do with. But I did find a show that was recommended to me when I was on Hulu, and I was hesitant to watch it just because it was a show from TNT, and it was called The Librarians. Now, I've only watched one episode, so maybe it goes downhill very quickly, but from this pilot episode, I was really intrigued. Now, basically, the show begins with the idea that magic was once real, and that all the different forts and monuments all around the world that were built were basically places to harness this magic, and different things that were created, like King Arthur's crown, for example, were things to harness magic. Now, different institutions, at least in this TV show, were created to basically bring in these magical artifacts, because eventually they realized all this magic couldn't be in the world. And when I say they, we're referring to the colloquial they, the they that controls the world. They decided that we couldn't have magic in the world in this TV show. So actually, libraries and museums and things like that within this TV show are actually secret organizations that collect and basically maintain different old magic artifacts. And another aspect of this show that really stood out to me is the fact that they say that the magic in the world lies on ancient ley lines. And I've received a lot of comments about all of my videos, really on every video, about ancient ley lines and how different buildings, structures, things of importance were built and or buried on ancient ley lines. And the fact that this show on TNT called The Librarians is talking about all of these ancient and esoteric things, and they're not doing it in jest, or they're not trying to poke fun at us who do this sort of research. They're really taking it seriously, and they're actually going into the nature of these artifacts and mentioning different hidden sort of esoteric things about these areas, whether they're true or not. It is very interesting, especially to see in a TV show. So if you have Hulu or TNT, check it out, because this is a show I'd never heard of, and apparently it came out 7 years ago. It ran for 4 seasons, and I'm just going to get into watching it when I have a little bit of free time and I'm not doing some research, because I'm actually finding topics that are presented within this TV show that are worth researching. So it's actually giving me some ideas of things to look into. So if you have some free time looking for something to kill some time with, definitely check out The Librarians on TNT and on Hulu, because it definitely talks about this esoteric, hidden agenda, old world stuff that we talk about in these videos, and I think you guys would really like it. So that's all. I just wanted to present my Stars and Stripes ideas with you, give a little shout out to the haters, and basically tell you to check out that show if you have free time and you're looking to kill some of it, because it's a show that actually has a lot of good narrative and things that want to expand your mind, and I think that's what we need today. So hopefully you liked this video. If you did, hit the thumbs up. Leave your comments and thoughts down below about the Stars and Stripes. I definitely think that I'm onto something here, but it could just be me. I might be completely wrong. It's just a theory, just for entertainment, just to throw out there, see how it feels. And that's it. So I will see you on the next video, and I thank you so much for being here.